Welcome everybody. This is the first of two webinars we'll be presenting over the next couple of weeks. My name's Pat Klub and I work for the VFF. I'd like to thank our sponsors today, which is the Victorian Farmers Federation and the Agriculture Victoria. We're sponsoring the project through the Enhancing Biosecurity Animal Welfare Project led by the VFF. We have two speakers tonight, myself and John Webb-Ware. And one of the important things is there's an ability to ask questions, so there's a question manager. You can click those questions and ask questions anytime. We'll try to endeavour to answer everyone's questions by the end of the night, okay? I'm going to talk about the legislative changes that will occur after the 1st of July. So quite simply, after the 1st of July, there's quite a difference in what we're going to do in Victoria. For many of us who already mule and use pain relief, there'll be no change. But for those who don't, there will be a difference. And this is from the 1st of July, pain relief for mulesing will be mandatory in Victoria, prevention under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animal Act. So that means that, and this is the wording, a person must not mule a sheep unless the sheep is administered with a pain relief product that has been registered for use on sheep by the Australian Pesticide and Veterinary Medicine Association, APVMA. So a couple of definitions of what we need to know there is what's defined as mulesing and what's a product under the APVMA. So what's defined under mulesing for this purposes of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animal Act is the definition from the Australian Animal Welfare Standards and Guidelines for sheep. So that is the removal of skin from the breech and or tail of a sheep using mulesing shears. So that's traditional mulesing, we're removing a strip of skin from the string, or tail stripping, or a combination of both, or one or the other alone. So if you're using that procedure from the 1st of July in Victoria, you must use pain relief. So what about the other alternatives to pain relief? Do we have to use? So that's things like clips, intradermal injections of chemicals, or anything else that modifies the breech, which is not surgical mulesing, and that's non-cutting technologies such as liquid nitrogen freeze branding. So in that situation, it's not, under the law, it's not required to use pain relief. So there may be, and John will talk about this, there may be advantages to using some of these products, some pain relief in some of these procedures. So what products are available? Well, there's a whole raft of products you can use, local anaesthetics, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and a few other things, anaesthetics that are registered for sheep. But we're going to basically come down to one of these three products. And that's trisulfan, which we're all familiar with. It's got a local anaesthetic, it's pain relief, and that's bupivacaine or lignocaine. It's a well-used, well-adopted product. It's got a 90-day withholding period, which is neither here nor there. It's available over the counter. The other two products which you're probably likely to be going to come across is Buccal, Jacek, and Meloxicam, which are both non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. They both contain the same active. One's an orally absorbed product and one's an injectable. And these products are non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So they're like ibuprofen or aspirin. They're probably a little bit stronger than those things, provide a little bit better pain relief than those two products, but that's the class of drug they're from. These two products are both S4s, meaning you have to have a relation. You have to be prescribed by a veterinarian, and you have to have a relationship with the veterinarian as far as knowing your stock goes. Short withholding periods, but again, it's probably irrelevant as far as like mulesing goes because you're not going to be selling sheep within a short period after mulesing them anyway. So they're the three products you'd most likely come across. You can use combinations of non-steroidals and local anaesthetics, and there's probably some advantage to that. You can't use Buccal, Jacek, and Meloxicam together because they're the same product, obviously. So that's the rules from the 1st of July. They're quite simple to do. This is a thing which most of us use anyway, and the rest of us are going to have to start using them. I'm going to hand over now to John Webb-Ware, and I think John's pretty well known to most people in the audience there, and John's a senior consultant at the McKinnon Project. He's a veterinarian, he's a long-time agricultural consultant, probably 30 years in the game, and John's probably one of the sharpest minds around. He's a farmer himself, he's a whole farm consultant, and has provided advice for over 30 years to some sheep produce farmers in the Southern Hemisphere. So I'm going to hand over to John. John's going to talk about what's the future of mulesing from the 1st of July on, and what if you want to think about stopping mulesing? What do you have to think about if you're doing that situation? So I'm going to hand over to John and step out of the way.
Thanks very much, Pat, for that introduction, and it's making me feel old, but we'll move on from that. And look, tonight I'm going to give you a snapshot of alternatives, really managing the sheep flock in a post-mulesing type situation. And firstly, I want to just update the current situation, talk about the changes to management required, and also just give a bit of a perspective of the cost of management of fly strike in an unmulesed flock. And it's interesting, when I started to prepare this, I referred back to a talk which was I think about 10 years ago now, and it was interesting just looking back at the sort of suggested recommendations back there. And I mean, on the whole, it hasn't actually changed a lot of the principles, but there's new technologies and there certainly is new systems in there. But I guess it's sort of pertinent just to get the ball rolling to talk. What's actually happening is in the sheep flock in Australia now. This is just showing the national wool declaration rates by mulesing status across Australia and the trends since 2008. To the current time, and it includes all bales, in all breeds and all wool types. So the categories are non-mulesed, and you can see there's actually been a steady trend upwards since then, and ceased mulesing. So you could combine those two lots together effectively because they're going down the same path. There's been a big change and obviously with analgesia, and since the first data there was recorded in 2008, and mulesing has steadily declined. But I think you've got to be a bit careful in terms of, because this combines all sheep, and there's been change in the demographic of the sheep industry in terms of more prime lamb type breeds as well. So I think that's so in terms of the change in merinos is probably a little bit more significant than what we see in this data, but it gives you a bit of a snapshot of what's happening. And there's the amount of non-declared wool is dropped significantly, and I suspect a lot of that would be more some of the prime lamb type breeds and broader wool. So in terms of one thing which should be interesting to look at is to start off with, what's the change in premiums and discounts for both ceased mulesed and non-mulesed wool, and this is over the last 10 years. And this graph was kindly provided by Andrew Woods from Independent Commodity Services, and it shows the actual auction wool only. So, and need to keep that in mind because it's very difficult to get data on the non-auction wool in terms of specific specifications and so on. And also just pointing out that we're looking at wool with sound staple 40 newtons per kilotex right in the sweet spot, this sort of thing. And you can see the trends in the premiums for ceased mulesed and non-mulesed wool has gradually increased over time, but it hasn't dramatically increased. And the biggest increase has been for the finer wool over the last 10 years ago, and in the current year to date, there's bigger premiums, although those premiums, I think just in recent times post-COVID, since the wool prices have dropped, has diminished somewhat. But I think, and you can see, look, the average for all wool types is still only about 2%, and has been tracking along less than that. But if we look at the finer wool, certainly there's been bigger premiums have occurred. So that's relevant to consider, but I think it's important to consider that I think some of the specialist markets where there's direct sales are attracting much higher premiums than what we're seeing in the auction system. So it's certainly the bigger premiums for finer wool with sound wool, but interesting even with finer wool, even with the staple strength and Newton per kilotex at 35 is the premium is only half what it is at 40 newtons per kilotex, and there's virtually no premium for tender types. So it's sort of really for the high, better quality sound wool, which is finer, which is attracting the biggest premiums at this stage. So in terms of a separate analysis done by AWEX, it's a few years old now, but it's still sort of relevant. And there's what the summation of that, the small discounts actually for non-declared wool, so that's important to consider, but only relatively small. The largest premiums, of course, is for non-mulesed wool, and there's also a small premium there with mulesed wool with pain relief. So, and the other part of the premium discount, which is not often talked about, is is there any for livestock sales from non-mulesed flocks? Is there a premium there? And look, and Jeff Linden did a survey of producers which had ceased mulesing a couple of years ago now, and there was anecdotal evidence of the discount, particularly for younger ewes for non-mulesed in the marketplace of, I think it was between 0 and 40%, depending on the producer's experience, but it came up with a sort of figure of 25% discount and that was for non-mulesed sheep, obviously with the perceptions of more difficult management. But in terms of non-mulesed flocks for lambs and so on, there's very little evidence of anything out there. Some people talk of perhaps 1% of a recent survey which we're doing at the moment. There was one claimed a small discount, but they're largely not there. So in terms of, I just want to talk about changes in management, which to consider in the post-mulesing environment is these are the things I want to talk about: breech modification, time of shearing, and in conjunction with that, times the crutching, chemical control, worm control, and just touch on additional supervision and labour as been relevant issues. I could talk about this for a lot longer than what we've got tonight, so I'll try and keep things as brief to keep us on track. But I think just taking a step back though, I mean, your impact of not mulesing, you've got to consider in the first port, it really will depend on the type of climate you're in, and certainly I've no doubt that the biggest impact and biggest management issues will be in the higher rainfall areas where more moisture, more breech strike due to worms and dags, and so certainly I think that's going to be, it's more difficult, and in my experience that is certainly the case up to date. Obviously it depends on breed. I mean, I look at to be perfectly honest, a lot of the prime lamb breeds, it's pretty easy sailing where at the moment in the non-mules there has been advantages of mulesing in terms of breech strike control and the like, but compared to merinos, it is more difficult, but there's a big variation in merinos in terms of management, and for all merinos it's in lower rainfall areas it is more easy to management, but we've got to consider all things. And I mean, the other factor in impact depends on the existing labour resources and current timing of management events, how difficult it will be, but in larger flocks where it will add an extra level of complexity in terms of supervision of management, which needs to be considered as well. So in terms of, I think to start with, I mean, it's really important to consider your risk of breech strike within your flock as it is at the moment, and take out the environmental factors, but breech wrinkle, The breach coverage is also important as well, and of course in the higher rainfall areas in southern, south, eastern Australia in particular, where dags are a real issue as well. And I just want to mention tail length under that, because that's a sleeper which still goes under the table, which I reckon is a really important part of breach management, is tail length of sheep. So we'll consider that. So if we look at just in the why breach wrinkle is important in terms of management. Here's your standard. Most of you would have seen this. The visual score of breach wrinkle from a score 1 up to a score 5 Vermont type merino, and all in between. And you can see in the next slide the percentage of sheep with breech strikes with different wrinkle scores. It's quite dramatic in terms of once you're down to a breech score of 2, the risk of breech strike is a lot lower, but steadily increases with all classes of sheep over a wrinkle score of 2. And for breeding ewes, wrinkle score 5, it actually shows over 100%. And that's just reflective. You've treated them, they've got restruck under high risk situations. So that's a really important point in terms of trying to pull back the breech wrinkle of sheep in terms of if you're wanting to reduce the amount of breech strike. So just in terms of dags, and again, I'm just showing you a standard scoring system here to give a perspective, say from a dag score 1 with no dags up to the real rattlers, a dag score 5, which you'll see in particularly southern Victoria, Tasmania, and also higher rainfall areas of the southwest slopes of New South Wales, but not in the tablelands type country where there's slightly different, different worms, which are the predominant ones. It's where you've got the small intestinal trachs, where you've got the biggest dag issues. So, and a little bit in southwest Western Australia as well, but certainly I think the most challenging areas are southern Victoria, Tasmania, perhaps southeast South Australia too, and southwest slopes New South Wales. And this just shows the incidence of strike with a couple of different example flocks with different dag scores. And in the first flock here, you can see most of the sheep are dag score 1, and there's a few sheep which have got dags on them, dag score 2, but no sheep have got dag score 5. But look at the incidence of breech strike in the different categories up to a dag score 4. You're looking at roughly 70% of sheep were at risk of breech or had breech strike. If you look in the next example flock, where you had the proportion of there was more daggy sheep, of course, compared to the first flock. So most the dags scored 2, but there's some 3s and 4s and a few 5s. But again, exactly the same type of trend, where the risk of breech strike dramatically escalated with extra dags. And so if you consider that 2 lots of data, both the breech wrinkle and the dag score, that's why it's a really important factor in terms of management of particularly merinos post-mulesing, but any type of sheep. Okay, and just to put in perspective, mulesing typically reduces the breech wrinkle by about 1 score, but it has, depending on the type of sheep, if they're plain-bodied sheep, it might be only a half a wrinkle score improvement, but for really wrinkly sheep, it might be a 1.5 wrinkle improvement. And also mulesing reduces the amount of dagginess of sheep by an average of 0.4 of a score. So mulesing, you can see why mulesing's been so effective in terms of controlling dags, and there's a whole plethora of trials over the years to show this. But I think it's important just to talk about, genetic progress. and for a start, it is slow genetic progress, but it's permanent and cumulative. So over a period of time, you can make meaningful differences to the breech of your sheep and also Dags. In terms of what's happened since the data's been recorded in Merino Select, the database, breech wrinkles has reduced by only about 0.2 of a score, but that's including a lot of flocks which have recently gone into Merino Select as well. So it's sort of, if you stripped out the flocks which have been making selecting for wrinkle score, it's actually a much better figure than that. Breech cover and dag score has been steady in the Merino Select database because, to be perfectly honest, there hasn't been as much selection, and particularly with dag score, it's impossible to select for dag score in a lower rainfall environment where dags aren't there. But it's a real issue for people buying sheep from dry areas and introducing them to a higher rainfall climate. So, I mean, obviously the importance of both wrinkle and dag score and cover, it depends on climate. And as I said, I mean, it's a higher rainfall climates that you've got a larger challenge. So, I mean, and both breech wrinkle and I mean breech cover and dags are important, but you can make meaningful progress over time. But another principle of selection, the more traits you select for, generally, unless they're highly correlated, the slower the progress in individual traits if you put more traits in the selection basket. So, but you can make progress if you're wanting to reduce in high risk climates where you're wanting to reduce both wrinkle and dags. You can still increase fleece weight but at a lower level, but there's a real challenge in reducing fibre diameter if that's the way you want to go. But a lot of people have got fine enough anyway, so it's perhaps not as big an issue as what it would have been 10 years ago, where premiums for fineness were a lot greater. But it's still an issue to consider. In a low dag risk climate where you're just focusing on wrinkle score, there's less impact on the important wool traits, but it's still an issue. So just to put this in perspective, this is an old data. I pulled this from Flyboss website to show where you've selected in these three lines show the trends over a 10-year period of time with different emphasis on selection for wrinkle. So if you've got no selection for wrinkle, then over a 10-year period, and this was old 10% index with staple strength, I think it was, but you could make a 9% improvement in fleece weight and reduce fibre diameter by 1.6 micron. If you have 20% emphasis on wrinkle score, so you actually reduce wrinkle score over 10 years by about 0.7 of a wrinkle score, then effectively halving your fleece weight progress, but not making a big difference to fibre diameter. If you go for 60% emphasis on wrinkle, well, you'll make virtually no gain on fleece weight, but a reduction in fibre diameter. This is actually old data. It's probably with more recent information, it's probably not quite as dramatic that the difference between the groups, but it is still, I guess, it's rather than the empirical numbers, it's more the fact that there is impacts in other traits if you include selecting for to modify breech, and just dag complicates that more. So, but it is a really important, and I can't emphasize enough how over time is trying to obviously maximize your economic production traits, but also making it easier to manage your non-mulesed flock. Now, tail length is a real opportunity for a lot of people, and the recommendation is basically dock at the third palpable joint or just below the tip of the vulva, and it allows sheep to lift their tail and keep the feces and urine away, and so less dag formation, less fly stroke risk. And also the other thing, with a really short tail, when the sheep have got longer wool, the wool hangs over the top and it gets constantly wet, and that actually contributes to that risk of breech strike. And I'll show you some data in a minute why it's so important to have a decent tail length. And it's important in mulesed sheep. It's really absolutely critical in non-mulesed sheep. But if you look at the sheep flock out there, there's a lot of people which dock tails too short. There's other benefits for less vulval cancer, with a correct tail length. Certainly less rectal prolapse, and we see that with feedlot lambs in particularly high risk, where tails are docked too short and high risk of rectal prolapse. And also there's recent work which shows, I think Joan Lloyd did a study which showed that the relative arthritis risk is about half if the tails are docked at the correct length. So there are lots of other opportunities, not just reducing fly strike. Here's a couple of quick trials. I mean, look, quick's not the right word. These are sort of 50, 60 years old, some of these trials, but they're perfectly relevant to today. And you can see with both ewes and wether weaners, the incidence of breech strike in unmulesed sheep where they're tail butted versus if they've got a medium length tail. Now in that trial it didn't exactly describe what the medium length tail was, but that was closer to an acceptable one. The butted was clearly too short. But look, it didn't make a big difference in the ewes, and part of the thing, I think the medium was still a bit too short, but the wether weaners, it halved the risk. I know in prime lamb some people dock short. They think it's easy to bunghole them before sale, but they're shooting themselves in the foot. The incidence of breech strike in unmulesed merino lambs, and this was weaners 5 months after marking. It's a completely different trial, but this is short tail, medium, so and long, so just below the tip of the vulva. So that's and then a very long tail, so 1.25 centimetres below the bare area of the breech, and you can see a steady reduction in the risk of breech strike. So, and that in my observations shows through, and I've certainly seen it in my own flock where I purchase sheep from time to time, and I certainly try and avoid ones which are short tail dock, because I know the risk of fly strike is amazingly high, just like this data's showing. It just means if you've got short tail length, it's the risk of having to use chemical to prevent breech strike escalates. Keep that in mind as we talk in a minute. Okay. Other breech modification options. I'm only going to talk about new one, which a lot of you would have heard about in recent years, and there's and that's sheep freeze branding with liquid nitrogen, and here's a sort of spectacularly successful result of that. Looks very much like a Mulesing result, but with liquid nitrogen. But it effectively, look, it's in early commercialization. The recommended time with the studies which they've done at this stage is sheep freeze banding is at marking. There is commercial operators which are using this procedure now. The developer AgVet Innovations recommends the use of Meloxicam to provide anti-inflammatory and analgesia for up to 72 hours, and that's one of the registered products for analgesia. But what's important is that there will be some independent animal welfare studies conducted starting this winter to actually look at the metrics of this with the animal welfare issues, and I think that's obviously going to be an important part of sheep freeze branding moving forward. So I won't say any more of that, but there's still, it's work in progress, okay? So I just want to go on to some of the management issues, and look, time of shearing. I mean, when to shear? I mean, there's a whole plethora of different reasons, right? Shear just at the end of the growing season to turn off your cast for age and sale stock when they're in good condition, just before the feed quality and availability declines in summer. Staple strength management is one which is often given, although it's more difficult to control staple strength with shearing than what's understood, but certainly for younger stock there's issues there. Grass seed and VM management is a really important one. Dag management, feed demand, so shearing in winter increases feed demand quite dramatically, and that for a lot of people isn't a good thing. Shearer availability, labour utilisation, and fitting with your other management calendar, and for a lot of people it's still tradition. But I think then part of the one other thing is reduction in blowfly risk. So these are all important points, but I think obviously the blowfly risk goes up the pecking order if you can manage shearing time to reduce blowfly strike risk. That needs to be a part of the consideration. So if we move on with the time of shearing, so it will be a more important determinant of shearing time. Typically, late spring and early summer is ideal for fly control, but also the other factor in here with a non-mules flock is timing with regard to minimising the likelihood of additional crutching, and also the other thing is with crutching, having to crutch sheep which have got wet dags is a lot more difficult and unpleasant than if the dags are dry. So it's a consideration. And just remember, in non-mules flock, the risk post shearing and crutching is where this minimal fly risk is reduced to as little as 4 or 6 weeks, depending on the environment again. One thing with shearing non-mules sheep, it may, because slightly lower shearing times with dealing with the breech area, and particularly on sheep which have got a moderate wrinkle score, it might increase shearing times by 2.5 to 5%, and that might increase the cost by an estimate that there hasn't been a lot of detailed studies done on that. But I think one tool which is available to look at flyboss to assess the fly risk with different shearing times, and so that's one thing which people can go away with and have a look and assess the fly risk with different shearing times for their own flock with their own climate. Just with regard to, and I'll go show you an example in a minute, but with time of crutching, there's many flocks. In the experience is that in higher rainfall areas, not in lower rainfall areas, that many flocks will require additional crutching, and especially those flocks which have lots of dags now, and surveys actually confirm this. And so there is pressure on crutching time, of course, to do it within 3 months of shearing to minimise stain, but there will be additional crutching costs. And it's likely, depending on the flock and the dagginess, the increased time to crutch sheep might be, look, for some flocks nothing, but for other flocks it might be up to 30% longer, and that will increase the cost. And so timing of when you crutch is important. Again, the most challenging thing is when there's wet dags on the skin, and I'm just specifically talking the higher rainfall areas here. So if we jump to worm control, I think worms in the higher rainfall areas and dags are a really important issue. And there's two things with to consider with worms. Scouring caused directly by high worm burdens, so and larval challenge. And that's a really important part of good worm control, is critical moving forward. And also there's another factor of hypersensitivity type reaction with low levels of larval challenge will still cause scouring, and that's particularly an issue for higher rainfall areas which need to be considered. In terms of reducing dags, look, worm control programs are just fundamental, and I could talk all night on that, but I won't. But it's a really important point to get right. Resistance management, strategic drenches, monitoring, when to give it additional drenches, and so on. I mentioned sustained release treatments, capsules, and long-acting treatments. Look, they provide fantastic worm control, but there's a risk of severe resistance with relying on that, and just the sustainability of relying on that year after year. It does trouble me. To be perfectly honest, I've dealt with a lot of people in high rainfall areas which have never used them and never had to because they've got good worm control. But that doesn't say you still get really bad years sometimes, and I would keep it in the cupboard for those years, ideally, rather than rely. And obviously, with the dags, there's a genetic selection. And just want to make a point here, long-term selection for low worm egg count as part of your genetic program will make progress to reduce worms, which is a long-term issue. But be mindful that selection for low worm egg count won't, unfortunately, reduce the dagginess of sheep. You've got to select for low Dags to genetically change Dags. Okay, it's because they're slightly different mechanisms. Now, I want to mention jetting control as a really important, and the reality is that, and from surveys again, what we see, and this, and I know this, Jeff Linden's survey with wool producers a couple of years ago identified extra jetting was required on some flocks, and certainly in our experience in higher rainfall areas, that's the same. And we're undergoing surveys at the moment of producers, and that's certainly an issue, that there's extra jetting required, and possibly in some situations 2 extra jettings. And obviously, extra jettings are a trade-off with extra crutching, and sometimes it's a combination of both. But application technique of the chemical, whatever method and chemical use, is absolutely critical, and there's very good information on the Flyboss website and following that, and in terms application technique, dose rate, follow the label, really important points. And also what's an emerging issue is chemical resistance with blowflies to chemicals, and so some of the tools we use with resistance to control in sheep, we'll be talking about that more and more with fly control, I think. And here's a couple of the chemical groups, and it's more here for reference. Your dicyclonal or click and cyromazine, Clixin, which is the same as dicyclonal but a lower dose and a shorter acting product, and then the ivermectin, macrocyclic lactone groups, and here I've just got the protection periods, withhold wool harvesting intervals and export slaughter intervals for stock as well. And then imidacloprid or Avenge, which has recently been registered for fly control, depending on whether it's off shears or with longer wool, up to 14 weeks protection. And then extenosad with nil withhold, and but much shorter protection periods. So that's all very good. But what's there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years about emerging blowfly resistance, and a paper recently published which actually had a look at this, and it is rather concerning. And I'll just go through briefly what the situation is. That and so for different chemical groups, OPs, which aren't much used now except for perhaps with some of your dressings, ivermectin, extenosad, imidacloprid, cyromazine without, they're in the same chemical group, but cyromazine without dicyclonal resistance, and cyromazine and dicyclonal resistance combined. So there seem to be 2 different things there. But just in terms of, and here we're looking at, with OPs, the resistance was compared to, done in 1985, and this was comparing to susceptible strains. And so the resistant strains, and this is back, what's this, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, was effectively 5 to 60 times, depending on where it was in Australia, more resistant than susceptible strain. That hasn't changed much really in the last 35 years, even though it hasn't been used nearly as much, but that's perhaps no surprise. Ivermectin, which they looked at in 2002 compared to susceptible strains, there was a slight increase in the relative resistance ratio, and that's actually increased in recent times of the current data. Extenosad, again, the little bit of resistance compared to totally susceptible, and that's there's been a trend increasing there, but not a big amount. Now of products which have been looked at more recently, just published just very recently, imidacloprid compared to susceptible strains. Clearly, there's depending on which farm these samples were taken from, there was potentially a big jump in the resistance ratios. And if you look at cyromazine and dicyclonal, there was a big range in without dicyclonal resistance. There was a big range in the reduction of maggots, but Interestingly, there was a bit different between states. In New South Wales, the 100% Australians were both cyromycin and dicyclonal resistant, whereas Victoria was still quite high, but Western Australia and South Australia weren't so bad. So there's some rather disturbing picture emerging there. But I think we've got to be a bit careful of in vitro lab testing compared to exactly what's happening out in the field. But the reality is there does seem to be reduction in the protection period of products. So we need to be really mindful of that moving forward. And whilst that's quite disturbing, I think that the reality with what's actually happening out in the field, it's not quite as high as that, but this is a really important warning going forward in terms of knowing that unmulsed flocks are likely to have to require additional many flocks will require additional chemical control, particularly where their breech wrinkle is still moderate in higher rainfall areas in particular. So, I mean, in essence, what we're seeing is certainly dicyclonal reduced protection period, and I talked to a few people about this and said, yeah, we've certainly been seeing that, and that's been the case for some time. The protection period for ivermectin and cyromycin is still quite substantial. And this is on top of back in 2010-11, which were terrible fly strike years. A lot of the shorter protection period, the issues then was very high rainfall washing chemical out of the wool. So that's a separate issue again. So but when streak was struck with susceptible maggots, the chemical still had full protection period. So I think we're going to be talking, and this is early days, but we're going to be talking a lot more about resistance management and rotation of chemical groups. And I think what's considered now is if you're using more than one jetting within one fly season, is to use the different groups, and also consider using, if you're for dressing, using a different dressing compared to your chemicals you're using for jetting, for treating fly-struck sheep, and non-chemical fly management strategies, including your times of crutching and that sort of stuff, and dag management and breech wrinkle are really important. And I can't underemphasize those really simple issues in terms of application technique is absolutely critical, follow label instructions and dose rates and so on moving forward. But I think we'll be talking more about this, and I just wonder whether we'll be talking combination products, but I haven't got my head around that one yet. This is just very briefly, this is a tool on the FlyBloss website, just assessing your fly risk. So this is a flock in central Victoria, December crutch to February shearing, unmulsed with no jetting, looking at the relative fly risk, and you can see they're jetted in and the brown is for breech strike risk, and you see crutch in December. You've got a short period of taking the breech strike risk, but then it steadily increases, and then you shear, and then it drops off to low levels after that. So, and here's the same flock with a October jet, taking out that fly risk in over the spring period. So I think it's a useful tool to have a look at to manage for your own flock, and you can click on the map to show you the climate exactly in your area, which is quite good. So I mean, here's a couple of scenarios which December shearing with winter lambing. What will happen with an unmulsed flock where you're crutching pre-lambing. The cleanup before shearing is going to be a bigger job. Fly risk is going to be greater between October to December, so will require more likely to require a jet at that period of time. And then February onwards, there's going to be a breech risk issue, particularly with ewes and weaners over the autumn. And depending on, and we've got to be mindful of resistance status. And I think one of the things going forward is hopefully it'll be available to monitor what the resistance status of the maggots on your farm is. And that data, which I was talking about previously, was provided by producers submitting to New South Wales Ag maggots to assess their resistance status of the different chemicals. So with a March shearing and a spring lambing, So you may require a pre-lamb crutch, or possibly in a low dag environment just an October crutch. But if you're not crutching, you'll definitely need a jet in October to stop the breach. And then what some people do is do a pre-lamb crutch if it's a high dag area, jet in October, wait till the dags are dried off, and crutch in summer where it's a lot easier job, and then there's no extra cleaning up required before shearing when the dags aren't an issue over summer. And you might only require short-term protection in that situation over there from mid-autumn onwards. So just a couple of things to think about there. I just to finish up, I had a look at the cost of not mulesing. That should be 2020, not 2010, but we'll ignore that. If we take a flock structure with 3,000 merino ewes, 2,000 hoggets, 1,500 wethers, and 45 rams with a total stocking DSE of 8,100 DSEs. So if we look at this flock, current management, February shear, a May shear with weaners when they've got combing length wool, and move them back to the February shearing the following year, and so that does help with the staple strength management. December crutch and a breech jet in October, and click lambs at weaning in December. So with our post mulesing scenario, and this is going hand in hand with your whole breech modification story over time, and new additions to the management calendar may well be jetting sheep in March, particularly ewes, an additional crutch pre-lambing in July, just because the dagginess of the ewes going into lambing is too high. We assume that the average dag score increases by 1 in this flock, so from a dag score average of 1 to a dag score average of 2, and we've assumed even with the extra management, there's a 0.5% increase in breech strike in this flock. So so this is just a snapshot of the extra costs. So shearing is actually going to cost an extra $2,000 because slightly slower shearing rate. Crutching, an additional crutch, $11,000 for this flock, and extra chemical. I haven't added the extra labour cost of that, but you could easily add an extra $1,000 on that for extra labour. The loss of extra wool because more dags, and I've assumed crutching had to be was slightly bigger because of the extra dags, and that's a real cost. It's one of the reasons we always talk about minimising crutch size, but with daggier sheep, a lot of cases will need to be a slightly bigger crutch, but that's a really thing to keep in check. And so the loss of wool value by turning fleece wool into extra crutchings and locks is $6,000. Extra fly strike treatment for the 0.5% is an extra $400 just in time and labour. Extra supervision, I haven't put anything in for that, but that's a real issue. But there's also benefits too. I've assumed that there's a saving, obviously, from not mulesing the sheep. I actually haven't put a saving for having to do as much analgesia, but there still will be some analgesia potentially, so there could be an extra saving there. And I've assumed a 2% premium for the wool, non-mulesed wool sold. So the total cost to the flock is $16,000 or $2 a DSE, and the break-even premium for extra wool would be about 8%. So this is just one scenario, and we're developing a tool at the moment which hopefully will be able to be used by producers to understand for their own flocks, which I reckon will be really useful going forward. So, I mean, look, that's not all. Research is ongoing, and so we need to be consider that in terms of new chemical groups. Genetics, both in terms of genomics, understanding the fly genome and looking for weaknesses in there for control, and mutant flies. And there's it's blue sky work, but a lot of it's looking reasonably promising. But it's one of those high risk, high reward type researches, and also vaccine trial research is ongoing as well. So there's a whole plethora of research still going on in that field. And I'd love to talk about it more, but run out of time. So look, in terms of managing the sheep flock post 2020, I mean, the impact, look, it's going to be different in different regions if you cease mulesing. I mean, obviously, it's more challenged in the higher rainfall areas, in southern Victoria in particular, but other areas where Dags are an issue. Strategies can be adopted to reduce the impact, but it's not going to solve all these strategies won't solve all problems. Genetic improvement with breech modification and dag management are material changes which are important. The reality is some flocks will have extra reliance in chemicals, where other flocks will have minimal change in chemical usage. So it depends on a flock by flock situation, and also extra dags and extra crutching in particular will increase the costs. But I think really everybody should be thinking of how they could move forward with this in terms of managing their flock into the future. I think it's important. Okay, I think I've finished, so I will pass back to Pat.
All right. Okay. Look, thanks, John. That was really excellent. I'm not sure you can get many people to stop mulesing, but that wasn't the exercise at the aim of the day's talk anyway. But it certainly is. There's a few questions have come through anyway, and I'm going to try and take a few of these. Steve Harrison, who's one of the livestock counsellors for the Victorian Farmers Federation, sheep in East Gippsland, he's wanting to know, will we become over-reliant on chemicals?
Well, I think I mentioned that during the talk, Steve. But I think we will be relying on more chemical, but it will depend on the flock. In my experience, some prime lamb flocks which ceased mulesing, there was very little change in the chemical use I've observed in those flocks, and so obviously very plain bodied type sheep. I think don't underestimate the tail length as part of that risk management in those flocks. I think that's important. But I think the reality is for flocks which have got a wrinkle score above 2, ceasing mulesing, chemical control will be important. And whilst I didn't want to alarm people with that data, and I don't think we should, but one of the first tools in managing resistance with chemicals going forward is to understand the resistance status of your flock. So I think we'll as an industry, we'll be thinking a lot more about that moving forward. And I mean, it's not a dead end with new chemicals, but I think we'll be thinking about this more. And I haven't thought about it a lot, I must admit. But I think in terms of rotation of chemical groups, those really important things of application technique is just really important, and perhaps I don't know. I mean, I'll put it out there, but I mean, perhaps we'll be looking at combination type products in future. I'm not quite sure about that one, but there might be good reasons why it won't work. But I haven't thought about it enough at this stage. So there will be tools, but I mean, the answer is yes. Some flocks will be a materially increased reliance on chemical, whereas other flocks it probably will only be noticeable in the really high rainfall wet years.
Yeah, look, the Suez caprina has an incredible ability to develop resistance, and I think we sort of lost sight of that because we had the use of Cyanomethin for 30 years without any evidence of all of resistance, and now suddenly she's worked out how to get by it. It looks like anyway. And the other thing about, and you know, we've been dealing with this and wrestling with this in lice and worms for since the 70s, and I'm not entirely sure we have all those answers correct yet, but yeah, certainly I think there's got to be some more thinking about that, and look, there's going to be more reliance in some areas on chemical control as well. John, a question for you. You've had a few clients now who have gone over to non-mules flocks. what's some of the biggest problems they've encountered in doing that?
The certainly extra crutching and managing this is in higher rainfall areas. It's a lot easier in the lower rainfall areas. High rainfall areas where dags are a real issue, and I think the biggest challenge is the extra dagginess of sheep and the challenges with that, because I'm not aware of anybody which would put their hand up to say that's their favourite job, dagging sheep on the farm, but it's part of a routine procedure, and I think it's sort of it's something which it has to be done. It causes stress. So it's probably the challenge with the dagginess of sheep. I think the chemical control per se has been pretty easy, but I think what the flocks which I've noticed which have managed it easier is really trying to get away from having to dag the sheep when they've got wet dags. That is really hard work, and so it's chemical control early in spring to on the breech, and then waiting till the dags dry out from sort of late October, November, and then it's a much easier job. But so that's probably been the biggest challenge. There's extra cost, and I've really known some people where they're selling. They're in some of the quality assurance schemes, such as responsible wool standards and RWS and the like, and selling into higher value specialist markets where they're getting a premium, but it's coming as a package, not just the fact they're not mulesed. I mean, not being mulesed allows them access to those markets, and there is bigger premiums in some situations there.
John, I've got a question from Wendy Beer, and Wendy's question is, tail length. Your slide showed decreasing fly strike rate with longer tails, but what about non-docked tail?
Good question. We actually did a trial on this with prime lambs. Must have been almost 20 years ago now, I reckon, and looking at long tails, long-tailed lambs, and there was certainly compared to the dock tails, there were the two aspects of it. One is the extra the dagginess, and for prime lamb sales, a real issue. I mean, and you can still clean them up before sale, but the tail hanging over, just from a hygiene point of view, when the sheep are processed, is an issue, and the other issue, there was more fly strike in the long-tailed lambs. But I must say, in the year which we did it, there wasn't a lot of fly strike anyway. So it wasn't a really high challenge year when we did the trial, but there was definitely a material increase in the amount of fly strike in the long-tailed lambs compared to where they were correct. There was a correct tail docking. And I think that would be I mean, for prime lambs, young lambs, that could almost be manageable. But for keeping merino lambs, it would be I think that would just add an extra level of complexity. But I mean, perhaps more research could be looked at to understand that better.
A question which probably John.
Sorry, a question for you, John, and it's from Robert Brown. Is there any new chemicals in the pipeline for fly control, not counting combining old ones?
Look, there is chemicals out there, okay? They're doing research on it. There is promising chemicals. And I must say, look, I think if you look in the human field for external parasites, lice and that, there's products used in people which clearly have to be pretty safe, which are coming onto the market. And I mean, those with kids would understand that there's very few products on the market which actually kill lice in kids, and because of the resistance is so bad. But I think there is new products in that field. So I mean, look, I wouldn't say there's not going to be new products, and quite promising.
Yeah, there are some quite new chemicals used in dog and cat medicine now, which have insecticides, which obviously have good mammalian toxicity. Whether they'll make it onto food products or not is another thing, because there's a whole different issue as far as residues and stuff goes. There's one more question here, which is really from it's to do with legislative control of analgesia will extend to other practices, including tail docking and castration. I suppose it's not a question you could answer, John, but I work for the Victorian Farmers Federation. I can assure you there's at this stage, no plans to legislate control for those sort of things. And there's no requirement for it. I think the sensible change. It was a widely accepted practice in mulesing to use analgesics, and I think it's a sensible change to legislate it as an industry. I think it's quite sensible. But at this stage, there's no plans to legislate control tail docking or castration. All right. So look, I think that's probably does it for us today. We seem to have answered all the questions for the people. Yeah, it's about, yeah. So John, look, I'd like to thank John Webb-Ware for coming in tonight. John's done this coming into COVID Central here in Brunswick. He's taken enormous personal risk himself to deliver this lecture tonight. I think John's really sort of clarified how difficult it is to manage sheep in this part, especially in the high rainfall areas for not milk, and it certainly it's not impossible, but it certainly comes with a certain amount of risk and a certain amount of increased management risk and an increased management control. So look, on John's, this is the first of two lectures. We'll have Andrew Whale giving a lecture in a couple of weeks' time on analgesia in livestock. So Andrew is going to go through that's for sheep and cattle, different products which are available, including numbnut, local anaesthetics. What's going to be used for cattle for dehorning or castration, if you want to do that sort of thing. And so that's going to be. I'll be sending out a reminder to everybody about that thing coming up. As we leave tonight, you'll be asked to do a exit survey. So that's very important to us to find out how we've gone today. And it only takes less than 2 minutes. So I'm going to let you go now and just thank John again. And thank you all for attending. We had over 84 participants come tonight. So that's a terrific turnout for a Thursday night, and considering there was also another 2 webinars, livestock webinars on tonight as well, competing. So thanks everyone for coming, and good night.